Just okay. Good morning, fellow humans. That sounds good. It is a pleasure to be with you all today as we bestow the 2024 Joan Shaw Herman Award for Distinguished Service on Richard Reed, class of 1975. In a community that usually eschews prizes and honors in favor of individuality, creativity, and collaboration, the existence of the Joan Shaw Herman Award for Distinguished Service is a testament to the common shared value of service to others that we, as a community, uphold. The 2024 recipient joins a long list of alums who have dedicated their lives to service of their community and are an inspiration to all of the good we can put into the world. Now I'd like to welcome Mandy Adams, class of 2024, and Betsy Green, class of 1991, and chair the Joan Shaw Herman Award Selection Committee to share more about this year's award recipient.
Thank you, Henry. As a student rep to the Alum Steering Committee, I had the distinct pleasure of serving on the nomination committee for the Joan Shaw Herman Award for Distinguished Service this year. The Concord Academy Alum Association bestows this honor annually on a member of the CA community who has demonstrated dedication to service in either a professional or volunteer capacity to the world at large. The award was established in 1976 in honor of Joan Shaw Herman, who was paralyzed from the neck down after contracting polio the summer after her graduation in 1946. Although confined to an iron lung, Joan worked constantly for the improvement of the lives of others. Joan's devotion to others, despite her own challenges, exemplified the value inherent in the CA experience, a lifelong commitment to service. Joan Shaw Herman Award recipients embody the Concord Academy ideals of empathy, integrity, and responsibility as they personally strive to build a more just and sustainable future for all. And now I'll turn it over to Betsy to talk about this year's recipients.
Thank you, Mandy. Every year, we have an amazing group of nominees who have dedicated their lives to service to their community and sometimes even the whole world. This year, our committee chose Richard Reed. His dedication to responsible journalism and journalistic integrity really resounded with us. As we know, we live in an ever-changing time, a time where we can get instant information that isn't always correct. Important, true, honest journalism has never been more important. As I could go on and on about his amazing career, but I'll try to give you some of the highlights. He got his journalistic start working right here at Concord Academy at the Centipede. Back in the days when the student newspaper was edited in a building called the Jabberwocky on campus and then laid out at an Acton printing plant. After CA, he went to Amherst College and then worked in various newspapers for 40 years, reporting from more than 60 countries on all 7 continents. He has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one for explaining Asia's 1990s financial crisis by following a container of French fries from a Northwest farm to a Singapore McDonald's, and the other for exposing abuses by US immigration officials. As a Tokyo-based foreign correspondent, he reported from North Korea, covered the war in Cambodia, and chronicled the economic opening of Russia and Vietnam. And as a Los Angeles Times bureau chief in Seattle, he broke the story of a super spreading event among choral singers that helped convince health officials in the CDC that COVID-19 was spread through the air. So for his impact on the world through amazing reporting, it is with tremendous joy and admiration that I present the 2024 Joan Shaw Herman Award for Distinguished Service to Richard Reed.
It's amazing. Great. Okay. Oh, we do it. photos. Oh, we're looking over there. Great, okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mandy, Betsy, and Henry also for the kind introduction. I really am deeply honored by this and really sort of amazed. I thought this award usually goes to do-gooders and activists, and never thought of a journalist who might get this, but I like to think of it as standing in for a lot of other journalists who've gone to Concord Academy, Sebastian Younger, Julia Preston, and Alex Berzon being three of them. So hopefully they can consider themselves fellow awardees as well. Betsy mentioned that I spent quite a bit of my time overseas reporting, and when I was living in Japan, there was a Texan rancher who came over on a homestay with a Japanese farmer. And the Japanese farmer was very eager to show him around his rice paddies, take him around the farm. So on the first morning, they spent half an hour and they went around the little plot. And the Texan said, gee, this is kind of small. He said, no, the Japanese farmer said, actually, it's quite big for Japan. It's like 3 hectares. And the Texan said, boy, you know, on my ranch back in Texas, you could get in a car and you could drive all day and you wouldn't get to the end of my ranch. And the Japanese farmer said, yeah, I had a car like that once too. So ultimately, we're here to honor Joan Shaw Herman. And she, as you know, spent almost 30 years in an iron lung and nevertheless managed to have, as she said, an adventurous life. It's incredible to me that she was able to paint paintings holding a paintbrush in her teeth and do all the committee work she did and other nonprofit work. I have, I guess, a little firsthand experience with this because my great aunt Kay contracted polio when she was young, a little girl, and she nevertheless was a professional artist. She had iron braces on her legs and not as serious a case as Joan Shaw Herman, but she could drive. She had a lever on the steering column of her car, and she was able to drive herself around, and she was a really strong, independent woman. Here's another way of getting around. This was a Model A Ford equivalent to what my mother drove herself to Concord Academy. She lived in Lincoln, and she drove over to CA. She's here today. You want to give them a wave, Mom? And as I say here, she is a retired CA parent, me, and also my sister Kate, who's here, and my sister Lisa. So I guess both Betsy and Mandy mentioned that I kind of got my start on the centipede and apparently got stuck in a rut because that was about all I knew how to do, but I enjoyed it and learned a lot right here. I think it's incredible that my mother actually knew Joan Shaw Herman. They were just 2 years apart. And I assume, Angela, you knew her too. Angela Wilkins, right here, if you want to give a wave, is actually a classmate of my mother's and also a fellow award winner of the Joan Shaw Herman Award previously for her work teaching reading and other things. And then my advisor, I'm not sure if Bill Bailey made it here, but I was hoping he would. Is Bill here? Oh, Bill, why don't you give him a wave? Bill, I think, is in many ways still teaching. He still takes people on tours up to Sleepy Hollow and shows them Author's Ridge. At the Centipede, we had no advisor, which maybe had its advantages or disadvantages. I want to tell you a bit about something that happened when we were reporting. on the Centipede. And it has never perhaps been told before, even in Lucille Stott's great history of the school. But back when we arrived here, the Centipede was frankly a little boring. You notice these headlines: report on trustees, alumni help and resources on file. They're not exactly grabbers. Freshmen returned from Vineyard. Maybe the story would have been if one of them didn't return. And this one kind of amazed me. This was the story on the school deciding to go co-ed and admit boys. And you've got this rabbi, you've got the proposal discussed and CA films shown, and over there, just in a little corner, is this trustees vote to admit boys. So my wife, Brenda, you can wave, Brenda, she is much better at technology than me, so she redid the page to maybe what it should have been. So we didn't really want to do red or yellow journalism, but we did want to stir up the Centipede in our generation. And so we were kind of inspired by this underground newspaper, the Old Mole, that was circulated in the 60s and 70s in Boston, Harvard Square. And so my classmate George Perkins and I came up with something called the Old Rabbit. You can see it was kind of low tech. We just put it out on the mimeograph machine and we stuffed it in. We then had lockers. And George was the cartoonist. And he and I were Cambridge kids, just like Lucy, who's over here. Lucy, give a wave too. She nominated me for this honor. And we and others rode out on the train every day from Cambridge. It was then not part of the T, it was the Boston and Maine Railroad. And so we were kind of a nice little group of friends who've mostly stayed in touch. But George Perkins today, you can see him playing the guitar. He's a guitarist and retired architect, also a CA parent. George, are you here? Here he is. And the word is in the venture capital community around Boston that maybe you're starting a new newspaper called The New Rabbit. Maybe, yeah, well. So we eventually got tired of the Old Rabbit and we signed up to work on the Centipede. We tried to make it a little more edgy. And one of the things that David Duffy and I did, David, you want to give a wave? We went and interviewed the head of the board of trustees, and he said some kind of controversial things, and so we printed those. We had lots of other news material at the time. We had the presidential visit honoring the bicentennial and the big protest across from the river. And so we, as I say, we had a lot of material. The headmaster back then was Russell Mead. These are scenes from this big demonstration that we covered. Our classmate Laura Foley, who's now a well-known poet, took the pictures. And you know, I can't stress how much those times were just full of turbulence. So many things happened that in a way are parallel to today when you think of the student protests that are going on and some of the big issues that we're thinking about, Gaza and Ukraine and so forth. But when you think about back then, there was just so much turbulence. We had, you know, this massive festival that you've probably heard about, Woodstock up in upstate New York, attracted almost 500,000 people. We had a lot of unrest on campuses, anti-Vietnam War protests. And part of it was that we as boys were eligible for the draft. I mean, this was mandatory military service. And so as we approached the age of 18, it was definitely a worry. So it was more of a personal connection than even what some of the protests are about today. There was a rally for candidate for president, George McGovern, on Boston Common, and a splinter group split off and marched across the river and basically torched Harvard Square. I remember riding my bicycle to school the next day and taking a detour to ride through the broken glass. It was quite a time. And of course, there was the assassination of both Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. So we lived through all of that, as well as efforts to pretty much forcibly integrate the Boston school system. This was ordered by a federal judge. And so these kids were bused. Black kids were bused into white neighborhoods of Boston. It was pretty terrifying to integrate the schools. And there was a lot of resistance from the white neighborhoods. This was some of our crew. There was a little hut or cottage called the Jabberwocky that was out where the main green is today. And you can see I'm the guy eating as usual on the left, the long hair, and George next to me. The woman standing in front of the door is Susie Steinway. She was from the Steinway piano family. And then David Michaelis standing up, head by the roof there. He is now a biographer. He's written biographies of Eleanor Roosevelt and Charles Schultz, the cartoonist. So we had a great group putting out the newspaper. And of course, we had our famous classmate, Caroline Kennedy, as well. This was a field trip that we took into Boston one time, and we visited the State House. It was actually Mr. Bailey who led the tour. And we visited a federal court trial, and we got to the State House, and suddenly the photographers got wind that Caroline Kennedy was with us. And so they started crowding around us and trying to take pictures, and they kept asking, which one is Caroline? Who's Caroline? We wouldn't tell them. So they ended up taking pictures of each girl and then going back to the newsroom and comparing and then running the picture. Our heroes in those days were musicians, people including Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Pete Seeger, who were speaking out against the Vietnam War. Phil Oakes, Arlo Guthrie, who both came and performed at that huge demonstration here in Concord when President Ford was going to show up. And then also journalists. Many of them also were writing about Vietnam, that issue. And then probably most of all, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, which were portrayed in a classic movie that possibly some of you have seen, All the President's Men. I thought I'd just play you a clip from that to give you an idea of the kind of journalists that we were as high school kids trying to model ourselves on.
I'm thinking that Democrat paid for it. They were fun in the place. Well, still, we vote on the story, I hope. Right, I'm about the question posed. Martin, were you here? Thank you for what he heard and not here. Hi, this is Bob Bernstein, Washington Post, and I was just wondering if you can remember. Oh, President's Man, the story of the two young reporters who cracked the Watergate conspiracy. However, Mr. Olson, do you know how it was?
Well, why am I saying it's doing some investigative work?
You said they stumbled into the search. No, surprisingly, they tripped over clues. We learned to see all of the president. Only those transactions. The whole thing was a cover. It's running on those. And piece by piece, they solved the greatest detective story in American history. There is no way the White House can control the investigation.
I wasn't saying anything.
It's that if you tell the truth, nothing's gonna cover up. Don't you understand what you're trying to do? Actually need. At times.
So we sort of fancied ourselves as little Woodward and Bernsteins, and so that meant that David Duffy here, I guess you'd call him, maybe he was acted by Dustin Hoffman, and that would make me acted by Robert Redford, but nobody ever confused me with him. But this is David today. He writes detective books. He advises corporations. He's also a former CA trustee. David, in our day, landed a major scoop. Somebody, I've never asked him who, leaked him the information that a trustee of Concord Academy had managed to essentially lose $100,000 on the stock market, which put the school in a major bind. And so we put this in the newspaper, and of course, the headmaster at the time was furious at us, and we got in a bit of trouble. But one day I get a call from this fellow, Tony Lewis, who it's hard to really explain how influential, what a giant he was in his day, because there's really nobody equivalent to him in journalism today. It'd be like combining Anderson Cooper and Rachel Maddow and others all together into one person. And it happened that he was a Concord Academy parent. His son David was a class behind us. And so he was reading the Centipede, and he saw that we reported this amazing scoop. And I think he maybe heard through David that we were getting a little heat. So he called me and asked me over to lunch one Saturday at his house in Cambridge. And so I walked over there, and it was pretty incredible. I mean, he served a nice cold pasta. He had chilled white wine. So he was accepting me as an adult. The drinking age in those days was 18. And he had a big yellow legal pad, and he started taking notes, which I had all these visions of appearing in a New York Times column. And that didn't happen, but what did happen was that the headmaster quit giving us flack and threatening to yank the funds for our next issue. I had landed a kind of a hard-hitting editorial. Reading it over now, I might not phrase it in quite the same way, but the sentiment was there. And to the school's credit, they just did let us keep going. I don't know how much of that was due to Tony Lewis or not, but it was, I think, the way Concord prides itself on freedom of discussion and agreement to disagree. I know that's something Henry's been advocating too. I thought I'd just briefly lead you through kind of how my career developed, and then let you go to lunch. But I was, after working on the paper in high school, I worked on the paper in college with my friend Rand Cooper, who's also here, at Amherst. And Rand, I'm sorry I didn't give you a slide, but it's probably better. After graduating college, I went to this Nomon copy store in Harvard Square that's still there today. And they had just invented something really cutting edge called word processing. So I went in with a form letter essentially, and I had them personalize it to 100 editors of newspapers around the country. And I put a resume in there and some clippings of what I'd written in the college paper. And so most of what I got back was this very polite, see you later letter. I like to save rejection letters. So I got, out of the 100 I sent out, I think I got about 50 that were outright rejections, and 40 that, at least, or I guess it was 50 that didn't even respond, 40 that responded and rejected. And out of that, I got 3 job offers, so 3% return. And I ended up at the Oregonian newspaper in Portland, Oregon. This is what the newsroom looked like in those days. You can see the IBM Selectrics that we had. And we didn't have computers. So when you made a mistake, you just try to write around it instead of going back and with your cursor and correcting it. It was kind of an art. This was kind of what I looked like in those days. The work was fast and furious. This was a 2-hour shift where you'd have to get there at 6 a.m. on a Saturday and call all the local police agencies, see what had happened overnight, and then whip out these stories. So maybe 3 that you had to churn out before your deadline at 10 a.m. Some of them were kind of fun or, offbeat, but it was, always interesting. This was a guy who was irked because he lived on Failing Street. He saw himself as very successful. And so I went over to write a story about how frustrated he was. This was a guy who just wandered into the newsroom. There was no security in those days. He could just wander in, and he said he had a story to tell, and he sat down at my desk and I typed the interview down, and he had been snowshoeing out in the woods and somehow crashed through the snow and landed in this creek. And he spent, as it says, 3 days in there trying to get out, and eventually made his way out. He happened to have a climbing rope with him, and he managed to escape. This is my first front page story, Calamity in Kalama. Luckily, nobody was hurt, but it was a plywood mill that went up in spectacular flames. And so that was kind of the standard fare. In those days, newspapers, even regional ones like the Oregonian, had lots of resources. So they were able to send us to places on a moment's notice. I mean, we flew in a private jet over to cover this earthquake. Those were that was kind of the heyday of that era. I guess all along, though, I'd hoped to be able to do stories that, social justice stories, or stories that would stick up for people who, didn't have the kind of privilege that I had. And the first chance that I really had to do that was on this story. It was a murder case. This couple, Billy Faye Morris and Ben Croxton, were live-in boyfriend, girlfriend, and she had turned up dead at the bottom of a flight of stairs in their apartment. It was pretty clear what happened, but the district attorney essentially ignored the case, plea bargained it. This is what the mom said, that instead of a murder charge, it was criminally negligent homicide, which carried a much lesser penalty. And the implication was that this was a poor part of town, predominantly Black neighborhood. I'm sure that if it had been in Portland's West Hills, where the big mansions were, that this case would have been aggressively prosecuted. And so I did this story, and the cops weren't particularly surprised. They said, this is kind of what happens. The stage that I had heard about it, it had already been through the plea bargaining process. So all the judge had to do was do the sentencing. Ben Croxton was still out on his own personal recognizance. And so in writing the story, I was a little worried actually about my own personal safety, because here was this guy who thought he was going to get off pretty well scot-free. And in the end, the judge gave him the maximum possible sentence that he could. So, that's the sort of impact that I was hoping to get in writing stories. But a lot of it was writing pretty trivial stuff. Portland had this Rose Festival every year that they treated like almost royalty, literally, in the town. And so I was assigned to that one year, endless stories about, a special section on the Rose Festival, so forth. And then I covered science for a while, which was fun. Did a lot of travel and wrote about all sorts of different issues. And I got to do some investigative journalism. That was a investigation of this nuclear installation where they had made the plutonium for the Nagasaki bomb. And there was there were big tanks of, corroding tanks of nuclear waste right on the shore of the Columbia River. And they were trying to figure out how to clean it up. My dream, though, had always been to be a foreign correspondent. And so I couldn't really figure out how to break out from just working for a regional newspaper to getting sent overseas. And I applied for this really eccentric fellowship. They send 15 Americans abroad each year to work in their professions in Asia. And you have to be under 30. You have to know nothing about Asia. And they send you over. And so I worked for The Nation, which was based in Bangkok, Thailand, and was the arch rival of the Bangkok Post. And so I didn't know if I was even going to be able to do this, not speaking much Thai. I took a crash course in Thai, but it seemed to kind of work. And I stumbled around and ended up doing some war reporting and learning the basics. And so with that, my then wife and I, we moved, it's actually mother of my daughter Nehalem, who's here. We moved to Tokyo. And I started freelancing there and ended up talking the Oregonian into opening a bureau. It was great fun, just kind of understanding the Japanese culture, trying to learn something of the language. That was the Asia Bureau. When the newspaper opened the bureau, they did this big front page story about their new office in Tokyo, and there were kind of visions of minions running around, and this was it. But it was a wonderful time, and I ended up doing a lot of travel all over Asia, reporting. This was at the time Japan's oldest man. I think he was something like 115, who I interviewed. I went through all sorts of factories, and my favorite interview, I got to interview the Dalai Lama at his home in Dharamsala, India. I think it was Betsy who mentioned I also did some reporting inside North Korea, which is perhaps the strangest place that I've ever been. It's really kind of a country as a cult. And so this was the great leader at the time. I think you're probably familiar with, there was Kim Jong-il, and then now his son, Kim Jong-un, the grandson of the great leader who's in power now. This was interesting because that it's hard to tell what's going on, but each one of those is a placard held by a child. You can see their heads bobbing up behind it, and they could move those things, and they were trained so that they could, in a snap of a second, they could change the whole facade so that it read whatever the grain harvest was in the 5-year plan. Incredible kind of precision in that society. It was kind of alternately the most hilarious and spooky place I think I've ever been. And I got in there twice. That was the dummy headline for the second time. I also did some reporting in Cambodia and Vietnam. This was riding behind a Khmer soldier into areas that had just been liberated from the Khmer Rouge. And I did a story, a special section actually on Vietnam. Also did a lot of reporting in the Russian Far East as it went through perestroika and glasnost. This was my fixer in Russia. When you're a reporter abroad, you have to have a fixer. They're your interpreter, but they're also somebody who finds you a car to drive and gets you around and lines up interviews, and they're kind of the inside secret of every reporter abroad. Did a big project on the Japanese school system and how it compared to the US school system. A lot more pressure. And got to cover the handover of Hong Kong to China, Britain turning it back to China. That was amazing, except there were floods, and so you'd walk out of the subway station and have to take off your shoes and wade through the water at the time. And then I was in Indonesia on the famed French fry story that Betsy mentioned. And the whole place went up in flames. There was a revolution going on, got to cover that. That was for this story that I did on following a container of potatoes from a Northwest farm over to a McDonald's in Singapore as a way to explain the economic crisis at the time. And so we had a lot of fun with that. But that ended up not only winning a Pulitzer, but got me crowned as a Rose Festival Knight at Portland. The other big story that I got to work on with 3 other reporters was about the US Immigration Service and abuses by immigration officials. That was pretty exciting. My friend Tom Hallman also won a Pulitzer that year for feature writing. The French fry Pulitzer was fun because I didn't know that I'd won the Pulitzer. They don't even tell you that they nominate somebody for that prize. And so on the appointed day, when they actually announced the Pulitzers, which happened to be this last Monday this year, the newsroom all met because I guess word had gotten out that I might be a finalist. And they started rolling all these prize results, the Pulitzer for features, for breaking news. And then it came to explanatory. And meanwhile, I was noticing they were wheeling in cases of McDonald's French fries and cases of champagne. And I thought, oh my God, this might be happening. So that was that. I ended up sort of finishing out my career with the LA Times and writing a lot about the pandemic because I was based in Seattle. And as you might recall, COVID really hit Seattle first. And I had gone there thinking that I was going to have a sort of a laid back feature beat, but ended up doing a lot of breaking news on COVID, including we luckily got tipped off about this choir rehearsal that had been held. And it was almost a perfect scientific case study of COVID. It was a super spreading event, but they could tell that nobody had held anything in common. So they could, I mean, it wasn't like they distributed music for everybody to hold, or it wasn't like everybody had been, moving the seats before the rehearsal. Obviously, it had spread through the air. And so that was one of the first really pieces of hard evidence that they used to prove that people had to be much more concerned about airborne contamination and spread than by touch. Betsy, you were saying that as a nurse, you knew that from the beginning. Yeah, interesting. I guess to sum up and just to give you parting words of advice, I was really lucky because I feel like working at the Centipede and then in college on the paper, somehow I discovered my passion pretty early and stuck with it. I knew that I wanted to do it abroad, and so I managed to find a way to get overseas and do it from there. But I like this quote, find a job that you enjoy and you will never have to work a day in your life. So it's just something to ponder as you think about what you might end up doing. You might have several careers, several passions, but the more you can align it with what you like to do, and you travel the world and pinch yourself and think somebody's paying me to do this. That's kind of what you want to do. And if you can find a way to help others, as I think is essentially instilled in the education at Concord Academy, then you have kind of the perfect combination. The only controversy about this quote is whether it was Confucius or Mark Twain who came up with it. But that's the show, and I really deeply appreciate this honor. If we have time, I could take a couple questions if anybody has one. If anybody has a question, there are some mics up on in the stairs.
It's too tall. Hi, I'm potentially interested in journalism, and I'm wondering, like, how you knew what you wanted to cover, and like how you chose what aspects of journalism interested you.
That's a good question. So how do you choose what to cover as a sort of when you're starting out? Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of a balancing act because typically you always have an editor who's anxious for you to do some story that they're assigning. And often the stories that editors come up with, they dream them up in their back offices. And so they're a bit divorced from being out in the field. And so what I found was that if I always had, a half dozen story ideas in my back pocket to respond with, if some editor assigned me a dud story, that usually you'd get to do the more interesting story that you had dreamt up. And that's really the way it should work, because I think the best way to decide what stories you're going to do is be out in the field, get out of the newsroom and be out in the community, talk to people, observe what's going on. And that's how stories should bubble up instead of, sitting in the newsroom and trying to visualize things or having an editor suddenly assign it to you.
Thank you.
You bet. Anybody else?
What story that you've covered, really emotionally, touched you? Or
Emotionally,
I don't, Like, did you ever cover something that made you like emotional?
Oh, many, yeah, often. And, you know, it's interesting because as a journalist, you're essentially arriving on scenes where people tend to be in trauma, otherwise it wouldn't be news. And so you're talking to people who maybe this is the only time in their lives that they're going to talk to a reporter. And yet, you know, you're talking to people like that every day. So you have to guard against kind of becoming numb by the crises and the stories and try to empathize with the people. And it's often not that difficult because you're thrown into these situations. I guess some of the big natural disasters that I've covered, like the tsunamis, the one in Japan and the one in the Indian Ocean I covered, were the toughest, just because you saw this mass scale of destruction and injuries and death. And yet you really had to get it down to the individual level. And so I would try to find, you know, one person or one family to really get to know as intimately as I could. And I found that by telling their story up close, it seems to strike a chord with people a lot more than just trying to do the whole overall story.
Thank you.
You bet. Oh, maybe, oh, sure. You want to? Oh, yeah. My cousin Wendy wants to know how I chose the list of 100 editors to write to when I was looking for a job. I just looked at 100 cities that I could even imagine living in. And the two offers that I ended up really considering seriously, one was in Pocatello, Idaho, and the other was in Portland, Oregon. I thought, well, they're both out west. They both begin with P. And somebody was wise enough to tell me, you probably want to go to Portland. Okay, I guess it's lunchtime. I really appreciate this. Thank you.